Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peggy Cadwell. I am the statewide Title II ADA coordinator for the courts. This afternoon, we're very excited to bring you attorney Carla Mathers to our court consortium meeting. Carla is a published author of the book Sign Language Interpreters in the Courts, Understanding Best Practices, and is also an advisor to the New Mexico Judiciary in all matters related to sign language. A practicing attorney in Maryland and the District of Columbia for over 20 years, but her passion really is practicing and teaching legal interpreting. Carla, it is a pleasure to welcome you today. We want to thank you, and the screen's all yours.
Thank you so much, Peggy. And I also want to thank Teshet and Twyla and our interpreter Santana for working together to put this presentation on. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm in Maryland. It's been cold until today, so I'm sitting in front of a computer screen, but won't be long. In any event, I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you about the deaf community. As Peggy said, I'm an attorney, but primarily now I'm a practicing court interpreter. And my languages are American Sign Language and spoken English. My practice is, and I also teach interpreters. Since the pandemic, mainly online, but I also go places, certainly not as much as we all used to before. I practice in the District of Columbia and to a limited extent in Maryland. And that's primarily because Maryland's language access services are a little bit not up to par with things we see in New Mexico and things we see in the District of Columbia. So you all are number one and should be very proud of that. Our court language access committee, which I'm also on, kind of holds you guys up as a standard as to what we want to be like and the areas we want to improve in. So again, thank you for inviting me. I know that deafness is, in general, what's called a low incidence disability. But I also know that courts, when they report their statistics on the use of interpreters, usually indicate it's one of the top 5 languages requested, always below Spanish. In the District of Columbia, it's the second most requested language in our court system. So not surprising that in general it's low incidence, but we see it often in the courts. But it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind, until a deaf person walks up to you or you need to prepare for accommodations. And then it's like, what do I do? There's a great deal of diversity within the deaf community in terms of language usage. And that's really my goal today, is try to help you kind of wade through some of that and figure out what are the best techniques or strategies that you might use when interacting with a deaf court user to figure out what is the most appropriate accommodation for this person. Lots of it depends upon when the deaf person became deaf and where they learn sign language. And those two variables control all of the accommodations that we provide for under the rubric of sign language interpreting. Because there's a ton of people out there who have some measurable hearing loss that don't fall within the community of people who use American Sign Language to communicate. They may also need accommodations. Things like FM loops. We have something called an oral interpreter who sits across from the person and kind of displays speech on their lips without using any noise. That's helpful when the room is crowded and or people are talking all at the same time. That interpreter can kind of, indicate who's talking without the deaf person having to look back and forth. Just imagine a professor in a college classroom who turns their course, we don't really have chalkboards anymore. They turn their back to do something and they're speaking, and if a deaf person is trying to read lips, then they've just lost all of that communication. So that kind of an interpreter would sit in front of them, in front of the deaf person, and repeat. Some people use that. FM systems, loop, there's all kinds of accommodations for people outside the community that I'm going to talk about. And that's the community of court users who use American Sign Language interpreters. Happy to answer questions or comments or take comments as we go out throughout the hour. Feel free just to turn on your screen or use the question. And I don't know if you can turn on the screen, so feel free to use the Q&A feature. But again, I'm happy to take them as we go throughout the day. Going to start with kind of questioning some common questions that come up when people think about deaf people or think about sign language. And one of the most common is, what really is American Sign Language? Yay, it worked. So first and foremost, it's not English. It doesn't have the same grammar. It doesn't use the same words. But every concept in English can be expressed in American Sign Language. Lots of times it takes longer, but we have, if you think of a word as an individual word in English, we have fewer signs than you have English words. But through a combination of signs, certainly any concept can be presented in American Sign Language that can be in English. There's no word for word equivalent, which is the same as many, many other languages. So interpreters, to do the job, they have to understand what word in English means and how to convey that in a natural form in American Sign Language. It's not like drawing in the air. It's multi-spatial. So we use space in front of us and above us, to the sides of us, to indicate parts of speech or grammatical features. You can say, well, we also use our eyebrows and head tilts and body shifts and eye gaze as parts of the grammar of the language. So all that to say, you can say a whole lot of stuff in American Sign Language in a very short period of time because you're using different planes. And you will notice interpreters will be somewhat behind the speech, and sometimes they need more time, because if a deaf person is talking and they use all of this space to say a huge amount of stuff, the interpreter is going to need time to render that into English. I've also heard my Spanish colleagues say the same thing, that it takes X% more time in Spanish to say the same content than it does in spoken English. So it's not gesture or mime, but those things are present as characteristics and features that are used sometimes. Most often when a person from America is interacting with a deaf person from another country who uses a different sign language. But as a normal part of American Sign Language, it's not just gesturing or miming. We use pronouns extensively, far more than English does, and for different things. So, and our pronouns are non-gendered. So like the English word cousin is non-gendered. All of our pronouns are non-gendered. So that, again, sometimes the interpreter is going to have to stop and ascertain whether we're talking about a female or a male person in terms of whatever pronoun is being used. It's a lot like an it or that as a pronoun. So if I said that really smells, I could be talking about the refrigerator in the break room, or the elections. I mean, it could be anything, but the point is it's going to refer to something, and it won't be understood if you don't know what that reference is. Sometimes that thing that it refers to, the refrigerator or the elections, is apparent from context. Sometimes it's expressly stated. Sometimes it's expressed through an eye gaze where I'm looking. And sometimes it's done through a head tilt where I'm indicating a space around my body where I have already said this belongs to this thing, the elections. And so later, when I look at that space around my body, it means the elections, right? So it's complicated, but it does have rules. It's rule-based. Rules are easy, well, easy, any language, rules can be learned in any language. But there also can be fleeting and easily missed, particularly if you didn't grow up with the language, but you learned it as a second language later in life, like I did. So going back to that, things can be signed differently. If I'm talking about a car or a boat or a truck or a motorcycle, I'm going to use the same pronoun, what we call classifiers, to refer to that, because that pronoun, which looks like this, that means a motorized vehicle, and it can be moving, and if it's moving, then I still have to know whether it's a motorcycle or a boat. Planes are different. They don't use that classifier, but the point is, if I don't know what it refers to, I cannot accurately interpret it. Same thing with verbs. They have the same kind of ambiguity. The way you would sign picking up a baby, picking up a box, picking up a long thing is exactly the same. So I don't know what that is unless I have the reference. So that is why interpreters sometimes will need to go back and forth with the deaf person to seek clarification on exactly who or what are you talking about. That's also why interpreters will ask courts for preparation information. They need to know the context so they can properly set up the space to match the context. And they're trained to be very careful about doing that so that they're not giving away answers, or they're not, that they're very conservative in the decisions they make in doing that. I ask typically to see any photographic evidence or the actual physical evidence, because of the nature of the classifiers I was talking about. If we were talking about drugs, I could sign it like this. You see the eyebrows and the head tilt? That means, and there's also a mouth, but I'm not doing it. It means something very, very small. And if I do it like this, I've just changed a misdemeanor into a felony. And if all I heard was it's a bag of cocaine or weed or whatever. So I want to see the evidence so that I can see what it is that I need to depict. We call those things depictions, but essentially it's like show and tell. If I see it, then I can accurately match the nature of how I sign it to the item the court is talking about. Culture can impact that as well. In the deaf community, people who learn the language from each other also have shared norms and values. And And based on historical things that happened to deaf people, there was a long time when they couldn't work. So there was a group of deaf people who, many of them, they'd get mass-produced little cards that had the finger spelling, the alphabet in finger spelling on them. And they would stand around airports and buses and places where people congregated and give them away, seeking money in return. So that group of people earned their living that way, and they were called peddlers. That doesn't happen. I haven't seen it happen in a long time. So it may still happen, but not very often. That concept of peddling was represented by the sign selling. And it had a specific facial expression that went with it. And when you saw that, you knew this person was talking about deaf people who sort of beg for money. And I've been in court where the interpreter used this sign, or I'm sorry, I'm thinking of a deaf witness who used the sign, and with the facial expression connected with that sign, the person meant peddling. And the interpreter wasn't familiar with that cultural part of or cultural history, I guess I'll call it, because it's not current anymore. And they signed, I was selling drugs. Right, so you can see how culture can have an impact on the accuracy of the interpreter in legal settings or any setting. So typically we get that information from preparation, from trying to figure out what is the context of this case. Sometimes I'll ask the clerk or whoever knows, what are we doing today to get kind of the procedural information about the case that I need. But I'll ask the attorney, what's the case about? And that's when I expect them to give me, from their point of view, you know, what is the case about, what happened? There are times when, at least in DC, we have a pretty common police report that's used in preliminary hearings. And typically, the court staff will give interpreters a copy of it. And that's very helpful because then we get to get our schema in place as to what happened, where did it happen, and try to figure out how I'm going to represent that in ASL. So, American Sign Language is not English. Any questions about ASL or comments? So my next question, and would like to know what your thoughts are, is whether or not American Sign Language is universal. Because we get that question a lot. What do you think after just hearing so far what we've gone through? Well, it isn't. Surprise. When I told you that gesture and mime is used traditionally when people are communicating from other countries, is that because there are a lot of shared features, because they're all visual languages, so they all use space, they all use facial grammar, but they have different signs to represent different concepts. They have different cultures that influence how they communicate. Our sign language came from French Sign Language. There was a French deaf teacher named Laurent Claire, who came with a gentleman who had a deaf daughter or knew a deaf child, one of his friends' daughter, and they came to America, and that's how Gallaudet University was established, because Thomas Gallaudet wanted this French teacher to start teaching American kids how to sign, and he used French Sign Language to do that. So American Sign Language has strong commonalities with French Sign Language. You would think that it would be more related to British Sign, because spoken English and the way people speak English in Britain is so similar. But British Sign Language is mutually unintelligible. The only thing that makes it a tad bit easier is that sometimes you'll get some English indication on the mouth in terms of the mouth movement. They use two-handed finger spelling system. We use a one-handed finger spelling system. So it's more difficult for an American deaf person to communicate with a British deaf person than a French deaf person. There is something called International Sign, or IS. It's not a language, and most of its characteristics came from American Sign Language. It's used in international settings, typically among academics who get together for conferences. And there's an actual certification in IS for interpreters, but there's no community of users, right? I think at one time they tried to call it Gestuno, like the international spoken language was called Esperanza, but it didn't ever spread because there's no community that naturally uses those methods of communication as they grow up, raise their families, and go to work. And so as a language or language alternative, it's not viable except in limited circumstances like academic conferences. We also see it used at things like the Deaf Olympics, which we have. We have an international association of sign language interpreters and one of deaf people, and they use it in those contexts, but it's very limited. So I wanted to spend some time talking about lip reading. The one question that all deaf people can lip read is the question, can you lip read me? But other than that, it's catch as catch can. So much of it depends upon your fluency in English. If you don't have a strong base in spoken English, then you won't be able to lip read well. So if you, any of you or me, became deaf tomorrow, it would be relatively easy to understand some lip reading because we already have a strong base in the language. I think they have estimated that almost 70% of the English language you cannot see on the lips. It's created in the throat or in the back of the mouth, but not on the lips. So it's kind of a handicap in the beginning, or initially. But if you know the language, you can catch that 30%, maybe. It's like if you went home and you turned off your television and you watched the evening news without the sound on, you would maybe understand 30%, maybe more. You'd be relying on the pictures in the background and the chevrons in the bottom, but you wouldn't get it all. So if you went to Japan, assuming you don't know Japanese, where their alphabet is different and their language is different, and you did the same little exercise and turned off the noise on your TV and tried to read lips, you'd still have the environmental cues, but you would understand very, very little, probably not even 30%. And that's because you don't know Japanese and you don't know their alphabet. So that's very similar to the position of a deaf person trying to read lips if they don't have a strong basis in English. So whether or not they can read lips is probably 50, but it depends. When we have some people who can, best thing to do is to ask them how they prefer to interact. Deaf people reading lips is very similar to writing notes, because both methods to communicate with somebody depend upon whether the person has a strong basis in English. At the same time, depending on where you are, like if you're at a counter or a self-help clinic, it depends on where you are in the court. It might be okay to write notes for certain types of interactions. I have a slide on it, but if they're non-complex, low-risk interactions, then, and sure, it's probably okay. Again, the best way to know is to ask them. You have in your courts this device called a UBI Duo, and it's if the deaf person indicates that they are happy to write notes, short, uncomplicated, it's a device that folds flat and there's 2 keyboards on it. So you can stand opposite to the person you're talking to, and you can type in what you want to say, and that'll show up on their screen, which is a small screen. It's not like a big computer screen, at least the ones I've seen. And that person can respond by typing their response, and I can read it on my small screen. You have that available in your courts. You also have an on-demand video remote interpreting. It's an application, but it's a platform that you all can use, and it's called Certified Languages Interpreting, similar to Language Line, but it has sign language as an option for the languages. So you can do that. Comprehension tests when you're interacting with deaf people are another good way to determine whether or not you're being understood. So you need to avoid yes/no questions. If you use WH questions, you'll get an indication of whether or not they understand you if they can explain what they're trying to ask for or whatever they need. And WH questions are better at that than yes/no questions. And the other way to do it is to simply ask them how they understood what you just told them, or what your clerk at the window told them. If you just explain to them the process for getting a temporary restraining order, you might ask them, now tell me back, what are the steps you need to take next, so that you can get a gauge as to whether, or your people can get a gauge as to whether comprehension is happening. So lip reading, typically not a good idea. Depending upon writing, it really depends. And the best way to know is to ask. So I give you an example that kind of points out the dangers of depending upon written English. Take a look at that first sentence. So for a deaf person who understands American Sign Language and not English, their response to this, we look at it and we say, John is the actor. John upset Mary. That's clear. But because of our syntax, our grammar, this could be read by a deaf person as Mary upset John. And that's because we have what's called a topic comment sentence structure. There are many other sentence structures in ASL. That's one, and it's common. I call it a cause and effect, because that's easier sometimes to understand than the linguistic term. But essentially, the topic here is that John's upset. And the causation or the comment is that Mary did it, right? We would indicate that by lifting our head, tilting our head up. There's a specific eyebrow that has to be connected with the topic, a gaze that shows us where we've placed John in space, and a pause after we've indicated that John's upset. Then there would be a body shift, a head tilt down, or wherever we put Mary. She may be on the second floor, so I might be looking up. And then a statement that it's her fault. So if you just wrote this down in English, a deaf person might misunderstand it greatly. And in the legal context, that applies, the topic comment applies to all ASL. One more example before I give you a legal advice. If I had the sentence in English is good at passive sentences. The boy was shocked when he saw the blood on the floor. In American Sign Language, I would have to put, because it's cause and effect, I'd have to put the blood is on the floor. I'd have to indicate a boy coming into the space, seeing it, and then the comment would be their reaction, being shocked. So the same thing with a written note about a probation violation. In American Sign Language, if you write out probation violation, it means in American Sign Language that one is prohibited from going to probation. It would be a violation if you went to probation. So all that said is that if notes are used as an accommodation, one must be very careful that the deaf person has expressed that as an option, and careful that they truly understand by checking back with the deaf person to find out. Right. So I already mentioned this, but these essentially come from the regulations to Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, that effective communication is the key. And the best way to get it is to ask the deaf person and to look at the nature of the assignment. How complex is it? How lengthy is it? How dense is it? And whether it's high risk or high stakes kind of a setting. And with Title II, there's a requirement that primary consideration be given to the accommodation requested by the deaf person or the court user with a disability. So all about English, all about writing notes and reading lips. Are there any questions? Thoughts? Don't have to be questions. So you should just get interpreters for everything. Depends. And both with what I said about English and with what I'm going to say about language variability, there are some caveats. Primarily that every person you meet or your people meet will be different. And while there are some generalities, and I'll be talking about the generalities, there's also a great deal of variation. So I don't want to stereotype. I don't want to classify all deaf people do this. No, deaf people don't read lips, because that's not accurate reflection. There's just tremendous diversity. Again, some of it depends upon when you became deaf, and when you were exposed to a visual language. So at least I know in many areas in the United States, there are deaf people who are completely bilingual in English and ASL. We have a deaf university president here in DC. We've got deaf lawyers who, well, they have represented people in the Supreme Court, but I know they didn't argue it themselves, but they were on the team. But we have a Deaf and Hard of Hearing Bar Association full of deaf lawyers, and every year they admit new deaf lawyers to the Supreme Court bar. We have dentists, accountants who are deaf, teachers, obviously. So there's a whole other end of people that I'm not focusing on. And I just don't want us to overgeneralize onto all deaf people. There's also diversity within the court users that we see, at least in DC courts. And these do apply in some regards to some of the people we see. So variability means language variability. Some people sign very well, some people sign very poorly, even though they're deaf. Same thing with interpreters. And it just, again, depends upon where and when you learn language. Some stats. For anybody, the early years are critical for learning language. Once you miss that window for learning language, then it's always an uphill battle. And at some point, you will never attain native fluency. And the problem with deaf people is that 90% of them have parents who can hear, which means they're born different than their family. And in the family's views, and sometimes because that's what some medical professionals tell them, they are disabled or broken and need to be fixed. And there's lots of ways to fix. There's lots of ways, medical interventions that are used. I don't know if they're effective or not. I know there's brain surgery on infants that is terrifying, but I don't know if it's effective or not. And it may be for some people and it may not be for others. But that's called a cochlear implant. And parents spend a lot of time trying to go the medical route to fix the children. All this time, the kids are not learning any language. They can't hear, so they're not being exposed to English, spoken English. And they don't have access to any deaf adults or deaf children like themselves, so they're not getting visual input. To some extent, that's changed. There's more and more parents who are learning American Sign Language, or trying to, when they identify that they have deaf kids. We've had a lot of exposure recently in national events like the Super Bowl and other things. Things like FEMA, when there's a hurricane, they will have interpreters right next to them. There was a lot of that during the pandemic. So people are more exposed to sign language and see it as an option when they find out they have a deaf child. And 90% of them will go through that because generally deafness is not hereditary, except for those 10% who are born and they're exactly the same as their parents. From the jump, they share the same language, the same culture, and it gives them a tremendous advantage later on because they have a strong foundation in American Sign Language, and it's much easier to pick up a second language, written English, not spoken or lip read, but it's when we say bilingual deaf people, we mean they can read and write English, and they use American Sign Language primarily to communicate. So they're at a tremendous advantage than 90% of the people who have to kind of figure out how to get exposed to a visual language at a time in life when they've lost those key critical years. Even then, it's been reported that 75% of parents never learn American Sign Language. And I've been told, and I'm certain that it's true in the past, that they were encouraged not to by the medical community because they were told that it would, learning sign language would inhibit their ability to read English, to understand lip reading. So there are good educational institutes now still in the United States. One of the best ones is in Santa Fe. So it's a school for the deaf where young deaf children, oftentimes their families move with them. So they have the best of both worlds. They got the family and they have interaction with other deaf kids their age, and they see deaf people, adults, using the language, and they learn that way. So that's an important aspect of the transmission of American Sign Language that was there in the past that has gone the way of many other residential schools. They weren't well managed. They tended to be abusive, and the bad things about them certainly outweigh the good. There's about 7 that are still left in the United States that are very healthy, and they're, turning out leaders in the deaf community, and you should be proud that one is in Santa Fe. So if you aren't exposed to language in those key critical learning years, then your language is going to be disadvantaged or delayed. In the educational community, they call it language deprivation. And it sort of implies that, this person, there was no reason why they weren't exposed to language, but it was taken from them by not being exposed to anybody using the only language that was accessible to them. So it's sad. That's a sad part of our community. And hopefully it's going away, but it's still certainly with us, and we see it with the community of court users, and we see its effects. So when kids who don't go to Santa Fe, but they stay in their neighborhood schools so they can be close to their family, which is always good, but they usually are like siloed. They're the only deaf person there. And they may or may not have a classroom interpreter. And classroom interpreters, it can be problematic because just like with educators and other school personnel, they don't pay well, so they don't get interpreters who are qualified usually. They get new graduates who go to school systems because they know they can get a job while they learn their own set of skills. So it's a problem that we don't have a good resolution to yet in terms of how to make educational interpreting, since those interpreters become this deaf person's language model. And when those interpreters don't have a good handle on the language themselves, then that's what they pass on to the deaf person. So there was a case on appeal that in Minnesota where the issue was whether or not the person knowingly and voluntarily pled. No, it was a no contest. It wasn't guilty, but it wasn't a guilty plea. But the sign that the deaf person used, because it's the only one they knew from their interpreter, for no contest was no sports, because they didn't know, that's the only sign they knew from their background and growing up, but it didn't mean what it means in a legal context to talk about a no contest plea. So we also call that group of people sometimes atypical language users, because they're using language kind of wherever they pick it up. And like we said, sometimes it's a sign language interpreter who isn't. So we get this wide variety of fluency among deaf people, whether in how they sign, which is expressive, or what they can understand, which is receptive. And then there's this issue of conceptual comprehension. So I, as a hearing person, grow up, I hear the family communication at the dinner table. I'm exposed to the TV even when I'm in a different room. All of this incidental learning takes place that I don't think about, and I don't consciously do anything, but I learn that way. And deaf people don't have access to that. So there can be these fundamental gaps in knowledge about how the world works. I know what Miranda is because of watching television. Deaf people probably don't, even though we've had captioning. Because I don't know if you all have ever watched and relied upon the captions, like on the news or something. They're really, really bad. At least the ones out here are. It's not the same as how I learn information or any other person who can hear and have access to this fund of information that I can draw on. If I'm sitting in the living room and I hear the thunder crash, I know it's raining. But a deaf person's not going to have access to that information unless they intentionally get up and go look out the window. And why would they do that if they haven't been cued in? So every bit of information that I learn incidentally has to be focused on and looked at and intentionally gained. I say it that way because if you think about your ears, they are a bone, a series of bones. And they're not a muscle, so they don't get tired. Can't turn them off. They don't necessarily get tired. Your eyes are a muscle. Your eyes get very tired looking at video screens, at Zoom meetings all day, looking at an interpreter all day. It's almost, we've all done it. Those interpreters have gone to conferences that are only conducted in American Sign Language, and they're very, very draining. So it's interesting when I hear, we need to take a break for the interpreter. It's like, yeah, but you also need to take a break for this deaf person because they're concentrating harder than I am because it's their life and their legal case that we're here for. So the eye's a muscle, and it makes learning very different. For deaf people, it has to be conscious and intentional. So a couple of just common myths that we have. And considerations. They're not all misconceptions. But during the 80s, you probably didn't vote. Out here, it was big to hear deaf people can do anything but hear. And I agree with that. But not with the concept that they're just like anyone else, except they can't hear. And that's because of how they grew up, how they acquired language. Some people, in fact, are and would have the same fund of information that you and I have. Other people have been language deprived, and they go through a different life experience than I go through. And talked about incidental learning, and I talked about this slide already, except the last part where it says ASL is an overly emotional language. I've heard that a lot. I've heard people say they're so angry. Why are they mad? And ASL is no different than English. It's not overly emotional. It is expressive in that our grammar is on our face and on the way we move our body and the way we move our eyes. So in terms of your face, we've got two different categories of what we call facial grammar. All of our question types, whether it's a yes/no question or a WH question or a rhetorical question, and the topic comment, which is definitely does not have to be a question, but those kinds of sentence structure features are all done on the eyebrows. They're all above the nose. So there's different eyebrow movement for a rhetorical question versus a yes/no question. And there is also a head tilt and a body shift that goes with both of those types of questions. And then on the below the nose, that type of facial grammar are our adjectives and adverbs. They show size, they show intensity. You've got a house versus a mansion. So the sign is the same. How you demonstrate it and what your mouth does is very different. So you can see why people would think that it's an overly emotive language. And it's not. And we're not necessarily mad, or deaf people aren't mad. It's just that that's how the language expresses different concepts. Questions? Thoughts? So interpreters. I think just a quick note about terminology. Santana and I are ASL interpreters. We have a category of specialists who work with us when there are particular language needs, because I need the specialist, or because the situation requires, or because there's something about the deaf person and they can't hear. So they are called, in general, deaf interpreters. There's some debate about what they want to be called right now. Shocking. We're fighting about how we want to categorize ourselves. But what we call them are deaf interpreters or certified deaf interpreters. So CDIs is the acronym, or DIs. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into court and people ask where the deaf interpreter is. And they mean me. And I don't know why it is. Because they identify the Spanish interpreter by language or the Korean interpreter by language. But I get, where's the deaf interpreter? So in terms of terminology, I'm just the ASL interpreter. I may or may not be working with a certified deaf interpreter. Right. So certification is a problem in our field. We've had certification that tests you on whether you can interpret in a variety of settings, and it specifically excludes legal settings. So it's called a generalist test because it's just about doctor's offices, appointment settings, general settings. We had for a long time a specialized exam for legal interpreters that was suspended in 2016, and sort of diligent efforts are being made. It's very difficult to get money, so it's very difficult to get a new test. So what we have are generalist interpreters with training, and training in legal interpreting, training in different areas procedurally, like in domestic violence settings versus criminal cases versus real estate or landlord tenant, those kinds of settings, training in ethics. And Mexico has done a great deal to train their interpreters. So I'm confident, you can feel confident, or your courts can feel confident in that if your AOC, your administrator, puts your generalist certified interpreters on their list, then those people have the training to be qualified for your court. That doesn't help the rest of the country, but the courts that are doing well with training and ensuring interpreters who want to work on their rosters also take continuing education And I would also suggest that judges can voir dire any interpreter. And if they have a concern about whether the interpreter has a conflict or whether the interpreter is qualified, they should voir dire the interpreter and make a preliminary determination that the deaf person can understand them and that they're using the right accommodation. Talked about a great deal of this already. Ask the deaf person what they need. They are really familiar in explaining their own preferred accommodations. An ASL interpreter alone might not be enough. There are deaf immigrants who come from other countries, particularly in border states, that use their own native sign language. And it's a struggle to find either a deaf interpreter or certified deaf interpreter with those international skills that they can mold into some kind of understanding, or a deaf person who understands that native language. Because sign languages in other countries are not taught near as formally as American Sign Language is here. And to be quite frank, American Sign Language here is not taught to deaf people. In those schools for the deaf, they may have them in New Mexico, but historically, there's never been training for deaf people on the grammatical structure and what American Sign Language is, like we sat through with our English classes in high school and grammar school. So deaf interpreters are your friend. They're going to improve communication. There's a whole nother category of people who not only can't hear, they can't see. And the accommodations, you just have to ask, because it will depend upon, were they deaf first or blind first? Are they blind, or are they just low vision, like they don't have peripheral vision anymore? Do they understand a method of American Sign Language that we call tactile, which means they're hanging on to an interpreter, which is very stressful and draining. And they're picking up the signs by physically holding on to the interpreter's hands. And there's new methods, one's called protactile interpreting. All those things are very, very specialized. Traditionally, we use deaf interpreters, so a lot of them actually are conversant in all of the methods. And VRS is telephone system for the deaf, for deaf people. It's free. The interpreters are paid for by companies who contract with the Federal Communications Commission. There are a lot of problems in using that phone system in courts, mainly because there's no guarantee that the interpreter has been tested. And there's a federal requirement that you cannot identify the interpreter. The interpreters go by a number, and you can't subpoena them if they're involved in any kind of incident that's a nature or that's the subject matter of litigation. There's nothing the parties can do. So, I've already talked about certified deaf interpreters. I just gave you a list of, and you have this handout, but I gave you a list of different characteristics of deaf people or their upbringing that might necessitate a deaf interpreter. In socialization in the deaf community, other cognitive issues, deaf blind, mental illness, all those things to me mean that I need a deaf interpreter going in. And then some resources in our field. You have a great website in the New Mexico Administrative Office. You're already familiar with the National Center for State Courts has a program on interpreting, so there's a great deal of information on their website. But these are all resources that are by and of deaf people. So this is what they're saying about themselves. I'll only go into the first one because the National Association of the Deaf is a membership organization, but it's primarily a boutique law firm suing for access. And they do a fairly good job of partnering with large law firms all over the country in order to do access suits. So they have a great deal of information on their website for consumers who want, maybe they go to a dentist and the dentist says they won't provide them an interpreter, so they have advocacy letters. But in any event, those things exist, and these are the contexts for them. And that's how I will leave you, unless there's any questions or comments. I haven't seen any. But if something does come up, you're welcome to ask Tesha or Twyla or Peggy, and they all know how to get a hold of me if I have anything I can do to help you out. With that, I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Great. Thank you, Carla, so much for such a wonderful presentation. It is great to see you, and we really appreciate all the great information you gave us today. Have a fantastic day, everybody, and thank you for joining us today.